Welcome everyone to the Chesapeake Foodshed Network's Coffee Talk series, An Equal Exchange. My name is Yona Sipos and I direct program development for the Chesapeake Foodshed Network through Local Concepts LLC, a consulting firm providing the development and backbone support for the CFN. I'm joined today in the background by Sonia Kiner with the Chesapeake Foodshed Network, or CFN, and Local Concepts as the communication director. I'm also joined by two very friendly faces today, Lindsay Gilmour and Jeff Stoltzfus, and I will be very pleased to give them a proper introduction in just a few minutes. But before our main event, I'll just provide a very brief overview to the CFN. The mission of the CFN is to catalyze connections and collaborations that help build a sustainable, resilient, inclusive, and equitable regional food system in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We believe that by catalyzing connections and collaborations, we are better positioned to accelerate change within our food system. The Chesapeake Foodshed Network has been developing over the last 2.5 years or so. The leadership group that initiated the network's development did so because they recognized that a great deal of extraordinary work was happening across the watershed throughout to advance our regional food system, but there was no entity intentionally trying to build connections, trust, and relationships among those out there doing the work. So what we have here is a picture of our network building blocks. The foundation of our network is all about building connections, getting to know one another, sharing information and knowledge, building relationships and trust, with the thought that as we know one another better and connect with one another through programming, we might over time see opportunities to align and to work to contribute toward collective impact and action. If you are part of or support the extraordinary work already in process, as well as the vision of a sustainable, resilient, inclusive, and equitable regional food system, please participate in the Chesapeake Foodshed Network. You are welcome. The CFN is open and free of charge to organizations, businesses, funders, agencies, and other change agents working across the Chesapeake watershed to build a stronger and more resilient food system. Please visit chesapeakefoodshed.net to find out more. You'll note at the bottom of the slide footers, usernames and hashtags. We would love to see your tweets. We encourage conversation and connection in all sorts of ways. So the Coffee Talk series. The Coffee Talks are funded by Town Creek Foundation and the Prince Charitable Trusts, and are a platform that the network developed to help catalyze connections around specific food system topics. We partner with resource experts, as we have today, who provide a quick learning opportunity through their webinar presentation for food system change agents. And then during the webinar, the moderated Q&A, and in the follow-up materials, we identify ways for people to continue to engage and dig in deeper around this particular topic. So today's Coffee Talk is a follow-up to a webinar we hosted with Lindsay Gilmour in August of last year, where she explored food safety certification and the kinds of questions that farmers and buyers should be asking each other. For this webinar, Lindsay is joined by Jeff Stoltzfus, food safety educator with Penn State Cooperative Extension. They will look at two contrasting farming scenarios and discuss the steps they are taking to comply with customer and FDA requirements, and will take questions on GAP food safety and FSMA, or Food Safety Modernization Act. We are so pleased that at last count, 80 folks from across the US had registered for this Coffee Talk. So clearly, this is a topic that is on the minds of many of us at this time. Just before I finally get to a proper introduction, a few housekeeping items. If you have questions or comments during the webinar, we invite you to type them into the questions box in your GoToWebinar control panel, which you should be able to find probably by hovering your mouse toward the bottom of your screen, and not your GoToWebinar control panel, I'm sorry, your Zoom panel, and the question and answer box should show up there. We'll be collecting your questions and moderating the Q&A with our presenters following the presentations. And next week, we will be sending out links to a video recording of this presentation, the slide deck, follow-up resources, there are a lot of them, contacts, and a post-webinar survey. And so now, finally, the reason that we're here, I'm delighted to introduce our presentation and presenters today, speaking on navigating a treacherous landscape, a practitioner's guide to GAP food safety certification and the Food Safety Modernization Act, Part 2. Lindsay Gilmour is the owner of Organic Planet LLC and plays two roles as a personal chef and a food systems consultant. Lindsay has held many roles in the food industry over 35 years as a chef, educator, value chain coordinator, and now food safety educator. Ms. Gilmour has extensive training and is a trainer in USDA and FDA food safety standards, along with many of the programs, so many of the associated programs. Jeff Stoltzfus joined the Penn State Extension Lancaster County team in 2016 as a farm food safety educator. Prior to that, he spent the past 23 years as a farmer educator with the Eastern Lancaster County School District, working primarily with vegetable farmers. And Jeff lives on a small farm growing strawberries, pumpkins, and beef cattle. Lindsay and Jeff, thank you so much for being here. We are delighted to be hosting you, and we so appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us today. So please take it away.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen.
Perfect. And then I will step out, but I will be in the background, as many of our participants are.
So Jeff's going to stay on the screen now. We do dog and pony shows all the time, so we tend to jump in on each other's presentations. Jeff and I have known each other for quite a while, but really worked hard together on a group gap pilot for the USDA a couple of years ago. So for 2 years, we were in each other's pockets trying to figure out how to do group gap. So yeah, the treacherous landscape of food safety, it's a really big topic, and we have 40 minutes. So obviously we're just going to do the best we can to not gloss over, I shouldn't say that, to get through some information that hopefully will be useful to you. This is a very diverse audience today, and I apologize, some of this information may seem very rudimentary to some of you, but honestly there are a lot of people who are still struggling with the basics, such as what do I do first, what are my priorities? So we'll start by giving a very abbreviated answer to that question. It's really a 2-day training. And we'll look at food safety on urban and small rural farms. We're going to use a little bit of case study to go over that. And we'll touch a little bit on FSMA questions, Food Safety Modernization Act, specifically the produce rule. Neither of us are experts in preventative controls, but in the resources that you'll be sent, there are places you can go to find out more about that. We've both done the training, but that does not make us experts. All right, so I'm advancing 2 screens here, so if I look a little confused sometimes, you'll know why. So where do you start? Even if you don't have a customer who's requiring station, or if you know that you're exempt from the FSMA regulations, you want to start by taking food safety seriously. Successfully incorporating any new system is so much more about attitude than anything else. Even if some of the requirements seem counterintuitive or ambiguous, and some do, ultimately you do not want to make someone sick for obvious reasons. And if you want everyone to take responsibility for food safety in your operation, then it starts with the boss. And if you're not the boss, if you have a boss or a parent or a spouse or a farming partner who isn't taking food safety seriously or is resistant, then you may need some help with changing their attitude, because everybody really needs to take it seriously. And you can start by creating a pretty simple food safety policy that everyone agrees upon, kind of like a food safety mission statement. So first thing we recommend is you attend the Produce Safety Alliance Produce Rule Grower Training. So this is the approved, FDA approved FSMA training for produce growers, even if you are exempt. In most states, this is replacing regular GAP food safety trainings, and it pretty much fulfills that purpose. And it will help you to understand whether or not you must comply with the regulation, but more important, it will give you all the basic stuff, the important stuff around good agricultural practices that you need to know. And next thing is to train your staff in health and hygiene and general food safety. And by staff or workers, that's everyone who has contact with the food you are selling. There are now lots of tools available to you, digital and analog, to assist in training yourself and your staff. And we have a lot of these listed in the resources that you'll get in the post-webinar email. And I think one of the simplest things you can do is post signs, the really basic signs. Now, this when to wash your hands sign is funny, but actually kind of gets to most of the points you need to make. Visual communication is often very effective, especially if you place the signs in places where people will see them repeatedly, like the bathroom wall or in the break area. And then North Carolina State has created some great posters. Other people have created posters too. Some of these are specific to U-Pick strawberry farms, but the message is correct, so you may be able to use them. And then, of course, you can create your own signs. This is perhaps at Chipotle's expense, but I think it's quite an effective sign. I just made it up. But signs are just one strategy, and I've seen all kinds of wonderful signage in packing houses where all kinds of bad stuff is happening. So if you don't, you're not going to change behavior unless you reinforce and train and supervise. Reinforce the behavior with training and supervision. So a really good idea is to make it as easy as possible to do the right thing. So the first thing is to set up hand washing facilities where you need them, such as near the field or in the packing area, not just in the bathroom. If you have a larger operation, it can be useful to have more than one hand washing station. And even on a small operation, it's just, if you can do it, I think it's a useful thing to do, to put hand washing facilities wherever you can. Store gloves and the first aid kit in plain sight. If you are doing record keeping, you want to put logs in convenient places where you can reach for them easily. One idea that a farmer came up with recently was actually putting logs on a whiteboard, and then when each log was filled, take a photograph of them as a record and then start again. So that's a way of doing it without having lots of paper. And then installing safe and convenient places to store equipment. So the next thing is you want to start thinking in terms of assessing food safety risks. The grower training will talk about the key areas of risk and what to look for. And conducting a risk assessment and a self-audit of your own operation will help you identify where you need to focus your resources. And you can find many good agricultural practices self-audit checklists online. You want to find one that fits your operation. Some of the questions will lead you to research more about food safety, such as best practices for traceability and produce washing and so on, and they'll help you on your joyful journey through the food safety landscape. So you want to conduct risk assessments of key areas. What was your land used for before you farmed it? What is uphill from your crops? Do you have a big problem with wildlife? Even in urban farms, there's a big problem with wildlife. Where do you source your water from, and what use do you put it to? How are you washing your produce? Are you using raw manure? Are you making cozy homes for rodents and birds in your packing and storage area? These are all things you need to think about as you look around your operation. And what can you do to change them? And then I think one of the first records, records are something that people really resist, but they can be very useful, particularly if somebody comes to you and says, well, I think there may have been a food safety issue on your farm, and you can look back at your pre-harvest risk assessment and say, well, on this day, I checked all of these things and they weren't a problem. So it can be a useful thing to do for many reasons. And then creating a traceability plan of some kind. You want to be able to trace your product from the buyer back to your farm. And this is particularly important when you're selling to a wholesale customer. And then start developing a plan to address risks. If you have the food safety training, it's helpful to start developing the plan. And in essence, in a food safety plan, you record your risk assessments, the procedures you use to reduce the risks, and how you record these procedures. And there are, again, many resources online, and if you go to a plan writing workshop like the one Jeff and I will be holding next week, you'll be given templates to work from. So once you have your staff and yourself trained, and you've assessed and addressed your risks, and you're implementing a food safety plan, and your customer requires a food safety audit, then you call the auditor. Calling the auditor and getting an audit would be the last thing you do, unless you're required to do it for a market and you have to rush things through. Take things step by step. So that's a quick and dirty, what do I do first? So I was last week with a group of urban farmers in Pittsburgh, and one of the questions that comes up occasionally, and actually recently in a food safety training, was a rural farmer asking if urban farmers were doing anything about food safety. And the answer to that is yes, they are. In practice, food safety on urban farms isn't that different from rural farms. And now that urban farmers are starting to work together and aggregate product for wholesale buyers, they're finding customers who require food safety certification. And in fact, this group, even though they're exempt from the FDA produce rule, they have a buyer that wants them to comply with it. And so actually getting audited and certified helps them to do that. So I'm going to go through some of the questions that came up at the training that I gave to the farmers in Pittsburgh. What do you do if you have a lot of visitors? And on urban farms, they often have educational components. They use lots of volunteers. They encourage public farm tours. They encourage the neighbors that are usually really close. Or there might be a bus stop right at the corner of your farm, and there are people gathering there multiple times a day because part of their mission will be to show people in the neighborhood that healthy food can be grown right there in their backyard. And this issue is similar for farms that do U-pick and agritourism. So it's not just something that happens on urban farms, although it tends to be more prevalent there. So the first thing you can do is post signs. Again, some of these U-pick strawberry signs can be useful. But probably signs won't be enough. You really want to make food safety part of the education you provide, and you want to train your staff to enforce it. So actually, if you're having an educational program with visitors, make food safety part of that educational program. And on days when you expect a lot of visitors, you may need more staff or trained volunteers to help. If a bus stop is right next to your farm, as was the case with one of the Pittsburgh farms, and sometimes, as you can see in this photograph, there is no barrier between the farm and the space and the street and the traffic and the spaces where people gather on the street. And you don't necessarily want a big fence or a chain link fence. It's very ugly. It makes people feel unwelcome. So we talked about having some kind of green buffer or green barrier, which could be, and I suggested berries with prickles, which is sort of a nice way to feed people, but also discourage them from coming through the fence. But also some sort of planters that have an attractive demonstration of growing food, but this is not food you're harvesting for sale, since people are likely to pick or damage it. Another problem can be grimy urban dust. This was the case on several of the farms. There's just really nasty dust in the cities. And this kind of buffer could also be helpful in filtering some of that. And the only problem may be that you have shade where you don't want it, and on a small farm you may not want that shade, but you have to think these things through. And then there's farm animals actually on urban farms, and more urban farms are including chickens or peahens or ducks, goats, and even pigs. And like any farm where crops and animals are raised, you need to think about fences to prevent animals from roaming through crops, buffer zones or barriers to prevent manure runoff, contaminating crops. You want to think about changing outer clothing and footwear when you're going between working with animals and produce. Again, same as on a rural farm. On urban farms, crops and animals are in pretty tight quarters, but with proper thought, it should be no problem. And likewise, using raw manure on rows of crops in close proximity and at different stages of growth, take extra care in calculating the time to harvest and try to create some kind of buffer or barrier if necessary. And also check to see how water flows. Even a little change in topography can help or hurt when you have fresh animal manure on the property. So the next thing is wild animals on urban farms. And again, as with rural farms, feral cats, birds, rodents, groundhogs, rabbits, raccoons all share the same environment. You may not get the big animals like deer, but you do have plenty of the small ones. And we had a big discussion about the cats because they're really helpful in killing off the other critters that actually do damage to the crops. But then you have to think about how to keep even these helpers, as with pet dogs, keep them out, or guard dogs, keep them out of the crops and on the periphery, especially where and when you are harvesting. So the dogs you can possibly train or tie out, but one suggestion for the cats is to use water spray on a motion sensor just to discourage them from coming into areas where you don't want them to be. And another thing that came up was just the relative size of things. So you should always check for footprints and crop damage and feces before harvesting. And then when you find evidence of animal intrusion on a rural farm, the best practice is to flag a 2 to 3 foot area around the spot and discard that produce. But when you're only growing 5 to 10 feet of something, that isn't terribly practical. So you need to probably practically take a good look and discard only what is contaminated. But it's something to think about. Again, maybe you need to put up screens, shade cloths, whatever it is that you need to keep the animals off. And theft of equipment, not something that you typically come across in a rural setting, but one of the farmers had a really beautiful stainless steel 3-bay sink that he'd found at a great price and installed it, and then it went off happily to somebody's metal scrapyard. So this is a security issue. The problem from the food safety point of view is it discourages urban farmers from installing better quality and potentially more food safe equipment. So again, you have to think it through. Maybe there's a way of locking it down, hiding it from view, some way of protecting it, but something to think about. Let's see, just advance too far here. So open compost with no animal manure. I was on one farm that had this kind of compost that right up against their hoop house. And there was no problem in terms of animal manure runoff, but there was a problem in terms of attracting rodents and animals that like to feed off of rodents. So you want to think about where you're actually positioning this kind of thing, even though there's no issue with runoff and animal manure. And maybe create some kind of structural barrier so that you're discouraging the rodents from getting into your crops. There are many good reasons to use fish fertilizer as a foliar spray. And actually one of the farmers that I spoke with were using it, spraying it on tomatoes to create a protective biofilm. Unfortunately, the FDA considers anything of animal origin to be a food safety risk. Even though there's actually no evidence that fish fertilizer or fish feces are a food safety concern, unfortunately the burden of proof is on the farmer, and I haven't been able to find any proof that it isn't of concern. So that's something I think all of us need to think about and work on. I'm not going to read through all of this, but Jeff and I did just see this guidance from the USDA on auditing aquaponics farms. They do audit them for food safety. It's a bit different from a regular farm. There may be other certifying bodies that and auditors that audit for aquaponics and have more experience, but we're only so far familiar with what the USDA suggests. So if you are doing aquaponics or you're interested in it, you'll get this slide deck after the webinar and you'll be able to take a look at this. And there was an aquaponics farmer in Pittsburgh actually who was asking about it, so I was glad to get this information. Again, fish feces are not, there's no proof that there's any food safety problem with that, but the USDA, because of the FDA's attitude, is erring on the side of caution. Another thing that came up was overuse of sanitizers. It's actually something that really concerns me. So if you have an aversion to using antimicrobial sanitizers on produce, actually, in this case, it was with someone who was making cultured vegetables and sauerkraut, and was concerned that it would affect how well that would actually culture. And then the best method for washing in that case is a single pass spray or a single batch dunk using potable water, so you're not reusing the water. It may not be the most effective way of washing everything, but it certainly is the least dangerous, the least risky in terms of food safety. And then I think this is my final slide here. Auditing can cost way too much for a very small farm. And one of the reasons I was out in Pittsburgh talking with these folks was to introduce the idea of a single entity certification. I'm not going to go into detail about this. I'm actually, I think, doing a webinar on this in April that CFN can send out on this and group gap. But it is a way of having one food safety certificate for a group of farms, and I think urban farms are a really good possibility for that. So this is what I do, but you'll get that later. And I'm going to stop right now and pass it off to Jeff.
Okay.
Do we want to do any questions now? Should we decided to wait till the end, right?
Thank you so much, Lindsay. I actually, I just had a couple quick things. And before I ask one quick question, I wanted to invite the viewer that has your hand raised. I didn't mention that option, but if you open up participants, you should be able to raise your hand if you have a question. But actually, for the purposes of the webinar, it's a little easier if you just type it into the Q&A box. So I wanted to invite the viewer with their hand raised to do so. I think that's Callie Alexander. So to please type your question into the Q&A box, or just to use chat if you would like another way to communicate that question. And there are other couple of questions coming in, Lindsay, but just to start, where can people get a copy of the wash your hands sign? That one seemed to be a little popular.
Oh boy, where did I find that? We can send it along with them.
We'll send it along. Okay,
yeah.
Great. And
I don't know, who knows? You come across these things all the time and you never remember where you found them.
Absolutely. And yeah, so let's hear from Jeff. Although actually, Kristen Markley just wrote in, I Googled PSA produce safety training, which took me to the Cornell site. Is there anywhere else we can find info about the PSA produce safety training?
You want to go to your state cooperative extension websites. Typically, those are the folks that are doing the PSA trainings. I know on the Cornell website, they don't have an up-to-date list. I looked at it yesterday. Jeff, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I'm unmuted, right?
Yep. No, you're unmuted now. We can hear you, Jeff. I'll hop off here and pass it over back to the both of you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, the PSA website is a good source. Sometimes, as Lindsay mentioned, they're not all mentioned there, so you may some of them may not be open to the general public, and that may be why. But that's always a good source. But you can always check out your state extension website if they have a food safety website. So.
And actually, I noticed with Maryland, it was the Maryland Department of Agriculture website that listed it, not the University of Maryland website. Yeah. So check that out as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Lindsay gave you a real good brief overview of GAP and what's involved. And I thought I would take you through a case study just to show you that it can happen, and it can happen on small farms. A group I've worked with since their inception, probably 10 or 15 years ago, is the Lancaster Vegetable Farmers Cooperative. Has become a large group of small farmers. Initially, we started out with 3 growers. When the co-op evolved, I think they had about 20 growers. We've now grown to about 80 to 100 growers. Growing 120 acres of onions. They've also added some processing squash and some cauliflower, but I'm going to talk mostly about the onion issues that's sort of how we got started. There's been, as I mentioned, these are about 80 farmers growing 120 acres. So if you do the math, that comes out somewhere between a half acre and 3 acres per farm. These farmers, many of them, such as the one you see on this slide, have corn, and as you see on the right there, and other crops. They may be dairy farmers. They may have off-farm jobs. They may have on-farm jobs. They may have businesses on the farm. Some of them have as little as 2 or 3 acres. Some of them have 100 acres. But none of them grow onions for a living. It's a cash crop. It's part of what they do in addition to the rest of their business. Let me back up one here. Can I do that? So let me just give you a little bit of their history. There was in 2000. Well, first of all, I guess the best question to start with is why did we go to GAPS training, or why do we go to GAPS for a third-party audit to start with? And the obvious reason for that is because our buyers required it. If you're selling to chain stores, if you're selling to institutions, if you're selling to those kind of, well, to processors, they may all require third-party audits. Our farmers, if we were direct marketing, it probably would not be as critical, but we have hundreds of small farmers in Lancaster County and hundreds of roadside stands, and so we've kind of saturated that market. And so we do a really good job of selling local, but how do we get into the bulk market, I guess, the wholesale market? We see the trucks coming past our farms, going to Walmart, going to Giant, going to places like that. And I always say it's kind of like a train going through your county. We have a Amtrak line that runs through our county. We have farmers that live along that line and they can't get on the train because it's just going through. Somewhere you need to have a train station, and that's kind of what the co-op serves as. It's a place to consolidate produce from farmers so that we can actually get into that wholesale market. The challenge is, as we get into that, we're dealing with a wholesale market that is used to dealing with large farms, used to dealing with farmers who bring them tractor trailer load lots of onions and tomatoes and sweet corn and things like that. Our small farmers obviously can't fill one truck, let alone 40 trucks on their farm. So that's why we've kind of banded together in these co-ops to bring produce from multiple farms so that we can, as a group, function as one large farm. And so the co-op actually started probably, as I mentioned, probably in 04, 05. The first time we needed audits was 2011. A lot of the stores were just beginning to require it. So in 2011, we kind of did a pilot project where we had 5 farmers that received third-party audits just to see how it worked and convince our buyers that we're working towards that. In 2012 and 13, we audited every farmer through a group, a private company called EquiCert. We did audits on every farm and then a separate audit on our packing shed. These farmers don't pack onions themselves on their farms. They put them into bins and ship them to a central packing shed. In 2014 and 15, as Lindsay mentioned earlier, we were part of a USDA group gap pilot. Many of our buyers began to insist on a USDA audit, so we got in on this pilot project and we did group gap. And I won't spend a lot of time talking about that. As Lindsay said, we can talk about that in another webinar sometime. Last year in 2016, the group continued with the group gap. And for this coming year, the buyer requirements seem to get stricter each year. And so we have had to have a Global Food Safety Initiative benchmark audit this year. So we're using Canada Gap, which is a global food safety audit. And so we will be doing that as a group as well. So our group audits, and I'll give you kind of a really quick overview of how they work, but we developed a food safety plan template. The unique thing we had with this group was they were all growing the same crop, onions, so a lot of the practices were very similar or identical from farm to farm. So as we put together a food safety plan for them, we could address a lot of the issues, the standard operating procedures, such as harvesting and many of those kind of things were kind of uniform throughout the group, so we could develop a fairly detailed food safety plan for them. There were still things certainly that the growers had to implement themselves. And then we followed that up with coaching to make sure the growers were following up with their food safety plan, making sure they read it and understood it, make sure they were following up with water testing that they needed to do, just to help them out to realize what needed to be done. And then we went to a pre-harvest twilight meeting. So the audits are typically done at harvest. The auditors want to see harvesting in action. So we did a pre-harvest twilight meeting just to remind growers that they needed to have everything ready for the audits or the inspections, which were coming up to see if they had any questions about any of the logs that needed to be filled out, just to make sure that they had a reasonably good chance of passing the audit when they came. We had record-keeping templates that we would develop for the growers so that they weren't having to invent all of this stuff themselves, and that we could kind of standardize it. We found it made it easier for the audits if we had a standard template and even a standard plan, because once an auditor went to one farm and saw their system, as he went to the next farms, he was kind of looking at the same thing, so it would become much easier for the auditors as they went through it. And auditors are paid by the hour, so the quicker we can make that happen, the more inexpensive it'll be for the growers. And just some of the forms that for the onion growers that we had them keeping, again, they were just growing primarily one crop, so it wasn't terribly detailed, like it might be if we were growing 20 different crops with different packing and shipping methods and things like that. But some of the standard things that you need to have is manure records. Most of our farms have manure of some kind on the farm. Many of our farms, almost all of our farms, have horses that we use in the fields, so we need to keep records on manure. Pesticide records obviously need to be kept. Worker training logs, Lindsay talked about some of that. The pre-harvest risk assessments our growers had to fill out. Equipment cleaning records, again, for our onion growers, it wasn't a lot. We talk about equipment cleaning in terms of things that contact the produce. Whatever physically contacts the produce needs to have a cleaning schedule and records that it's been done. Animal activity record, as Lindsay mentioned, we needed to keep those. Corrective actions, so if we are out there and doing things, we find something isn't working right, we need to make a corrective action. So if we see animal activity, for example, in a field and it's creating a problem, we need to write down what we're going to do about it. Are we going to flag that area off so that people know not to harvest it? Are we going to install some kind of wildlife deterrent to make sure it doesn't happen again? Those are things we call corrective actions, and we need to keep a log of those as well. Auditors like to see that you've been doing something to fix your plan. And water tests were a big thing. I had to keep reminding growers to make sure they have their water tested, make sure you get the results, make sure you have a number for those results. We had to remind the labs sometimes that we needed to have an actual count of E. coli, not just pass-fail. So those are the kind of things that we continually worked at. Traceability, of course, is the big thing. The buyers want to know that they can trace their produce back to the farm. And through this co-op, we were able to do that, even though the onions were brought into a central packing facility and shipped from there. Every box of onions that went out of that facility had the grower's buyer or seller number on it, so they were able to trace that through to the farms. Just a few shots of the packing facility, and the onions came in bins like this, typically anywhere from 30 to 100 bins per farmer. And so it really became quite a large operation in some senses, although if we go to other parts of the country where they grow onions, you'll see much larger facilities than this just on one single farm. But the whole idea of working as a co-op, getting back to the whole purpose of why we did this, was so that we could try to achieve some kind of economies of scale so that we could compete in the wholesale marketplace. And so we've been able to do that fairly well with our equipment and with our marketing, but the challenge is how can we do that with the audit? And how do we make an audit designed for a 500-acre farm work on a 5-acre farm or on a 0.5-acre farm? And that's the challenge. When we had 80 growers growing 120 acres, 120 acres in many parts of the country is not a very big onion farm. In fact, that would be a small onion farm in a lot of places. And that onion farmer would have to sell to his buyers one audit. For us to sell onions to our auditors, we had 80 farms. that meant we had to have 80 audits for our 120 acres. So if the audit was costing, for example, $500 per farm, that would be $40,000 to sell the onions from those 80 farms, from those 120 acres. If a 120-acre farmer went out and got an audit, it may cost him $2,000 or $3,000, but certainly not nearly as much as it was costing us. So we really looked at, is there some way that we can scale this audit so that we can make it more affordable for small farms? Lindsay touched on some of that she's working with urban farms. We tried a couple things. One was clustering, where farms would, 3 or 4 farms would kind of go together. The auditor would come out and audit them sort of as a group. When you get an audit, about 80% of the questions involve looking at your records and looking at your policies. And that can be done around a table. And so if we brought 4 or 5 farmers together, we could achieve some, I guess, some speed in the auditing process. And then after that portion of the audit was done, the auditor would go to each of the individual farms and look at the things that they needed to observe on those farms. So that was our attempt to try and bring down the cost, to try and make it a little more affordable. The other thing that we soon noticed was if folks would combine farms, we're all very independent. We all like to do our own thing. And sometimes we would have, for example, 2 brothers living on adjacent properties. They each had an acre of onions. You could probably throw a football from one onion field to the other. They were probably sharing labor. They may have been sharing a water source. And so we said, you know, wouldn't it be more efficient if we looked at those 2 farms as one unit and just did one audit on that farm? And so we looked into doing that, and some of the farmers actually did that, where they would have they would go to one farm. Instead of them each having 1 acre field, they would do a 2 acre field on one farm. As auditors, from a food safety standpoint, we really don't care how they divide up the money. We're just looking at food safety practices on a particular field. So that was one way that we were able to kind of scale the audit and try to bring some of those costs down, because by combining 2 farms, you can obviously cut your audit costs in half. So it's been a challenge to work at that. We're still working at it. Lindsay and I talk a lot about how we can somehow make this work on small farms. I think our small farms do a really good job of good agricultural practices. It's just difficult sometimes. Economies of scale are very real, and they exist in the food safety realm as well as in the marketing realm and the production realm and everything else. So it's always been a challenge for us to figure out how can we make this pay. And you know, I think our small farms are actually audited to probably a higher standard. As we look at the onions as an example, if we have 80 audits on that 120 acre farm and we ship 40 trailer loads of onions, for example, that means we've had 2 audits, 2 visits for every truckload of onions that we ship, as opposed to a large farm that ships 120 truckloads of onions and has only had 1 audit visit on that farm. So I think just by the nature of the size of our farms, they're held to a much higher standard. So we need to find some way that we can make it more affordable for those small growers. These are the 2 websites that Penn State has up for food safety. It would be great if it was all on one website and if they were linked, but we haven't got that far yet. We're working at it. The general food safety information and gaps, you can find some templates there of food safety plans, some sample plans. You can also find some of the audits, the audit questions that the auditors use. You can find on that GAPS website. And then for specific FSMA information and some of our upcoming meetings, you can find that on the other website there with FSMA. So that's the information that we have out there for Penn State, but most of the extension programs in your state would have similar information as well.
The other thing that Jeff and I do for each other is commiserate over the fact that food safety has a lot of gray areas and a lot of unanswered questions. So we get to have a little bit of a complaining party now and then. So there are a couple of questions here. Jonna, do you want me to go ahead and address those?
Sure. Thank you both so much. Let's get right into the questions.
Okay. All right.
I can ask them if that's okay, Lindsay. Does that make sense, Lindsay?
Yep, go.
So Will Gray asked, thank you for your presentation, Lindsay. Based on your experience, do you have any best practices for finding out the requirements of buyers in your region?
Okay. Best practice would be to ask the buyers. There isn't some kind of website where you can go and find that stuff out. The other thing is, if you're interested in selling to a particular buyer and you know someone else who is selling to them, then ask them what the buyers are requiring of them. Jeff, do you have any other thoughts on that?
No, you're right. You just need to have a good communication with your buyers and talk to them in the wintertime. One of my biggest frustrations with buyers was that we would come up with a good food safety plan for the group. We would have our group meeting in February, and then the 1st of April, some buyer would come along and say, well, we want something a little different this year, and we would have to kind of go back and try and change things in midstream. So make sure you have those conversations, in November, December, January, when you have a chance to think ahead a little bit about how you can, meet those demands. Don't wait till harvest time to ask them.
You'll also find there are some buyers that know something about food safety, or they think they do, and they have specific requirements. And then there are other buyers who just say, I want to see your food safety certificate. So if you get the latter buyer, then you can decide what standard and what auditor you would like to work with. If they have specific requirements, then you're going to have to fulfill those if you want to sell to them. So yeah, basically talking to the buyer is the best way to figure that stuff out. And then if you have questions, go to someone like me as a consultant, or your Penn State food safety educator like Jeff, who's paid to give you this kind of help.
Great. Thank you both so much.
Thanks, Will, for asking that question.
Yeah, and thank you to everyone who's asking questions. Please keep them coming. There was a ton of information in this presentation. So in addition to asking questions now, Lindsay and Jeff have graciously shared their contact information, and so there are various follow-up opportunities available. Diane Stas asked, what about certification for distribution entities? Our food hub currently delivers to schools and is not required to be certified, but we will be branching out to other institutions in the future.
So Diane, I'm not sure if you're asking about the food safety certification for your warehouse and trucks, or whether you're talking about certification for the people that sell to you. But again, you need to talk to the buyers and find out what their requirements are. But it is, as a best practice, a good idea for your growers to at least be trained in food safety, be getting started working on plans. And you should be if you have premises and you're storing and aggregating and storing and shipping, then you need to think about preventative control certification if you're covered by that particular regulation, and doing good manufacturing practices and good handling practices. That it kind of depends on what sort of operation you have, which way you need to go. So you will need to get some help figuring that one out.
And there are audits. If you talk to USDA, they do have audits available for packing distribution centers. So that can, if you need an audit for that. For the onion co-op, we did a separate audit for the packing shed because we felt it was simpler to keep that separate, and we were able to do some things there easier. But that also had to be audited in addition to the farms.
And quite often buyers will expect more of the distribution entity than they will of the farmers that sell to the distribution entity. So you really want to find out what your buyers are expecting. If you're going to someone like Sodexo or Aramark, they have some pretty stringent requirements around food safety. If you're sticking with self-operated institutions, they're usually a little easier to deal with.
Thank you both. So just following up with that, when do you recommend mock audits? So before getting to the actual audit, at what stage of readiness would you recommend people bring in folks who can just check it out before the real thing?
Gary, thank you for that question. I would say early in the season, so people have a chance to make improvements and corrections before they have an actual audit. So as soon as they have something that they're able to harvest and pack, be in more than one thing if possible, so that you can see. It's good in any kind of mock audit to see different processes of harvesting and packing, because that's what the auditor will be looking at.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
And yeah, I'm not sure whether you mean what stage of readiness in terms of having a food safety program in place. I think you need to have a food safety plan in place before you have a mock audit. You should attend somebody else's mock audit if you don't have that yet, but don't have one yourself without a food safety plan.
Great. Thank you very much. And continuing on the theme of auditing, Kristen Markley asked, is it difficult to convince an auditor to do one audit for a cluster of farms? So Jeff, speaking, I think maybe to the example that you were giving us with the onion farmers, what do you need to do to qualify for one audit for a cluster of farms? Is this type of strategy the same as group gap?
So the first part of that is it difficult? It can be, yes. You need to know your auditors real well, and yeah, they kind of say, why are we doing this? It is not exactly group gap. We did that kind of as a part of our group gap. It could be done separately. The USDA auditors that we use charge, and most auditors charge an hourly rate. USDA charges $92 an hour from the time they leave their office until they get back to their office. So in our case, our auditors were driving probably an hour and a half to get to Lancaster County. And so they are very open, at least the folks that we've worked with in Pennsylvania were very open to doing as many audits as they could while they were here. And as we explained, so that way they can split that travel time, amongst 4 or 5 audits rather than one audit. So you weren't having to pay for 3 hours of driving time. If you and 3 farmers did it together, you're responsible for an hour of that cost. So they were able to do that. It worked best for us because we were all growing the same crop. If one grower had been growing tomatoes, another one growing cantaloupes, somebody else growing lettuce, it would have been much more difficult because they would have been looking at different logs, different records on each farm. And so it would have been a little more confusing, I think, for the auditor. But where you have 3 guys or 3 farms doing something very similar, it works really well. But even at least, I would say, coordinate with a neighbor or somebody in your area if you have to bring an auditor in from a distance so that you can, save some of that travel cost. And they were very willing to do that. But yeah, when you start to cluster them, you need to explain to the auditors that these farms are all very similar, and send the auditors a copy of your food safety plan ahead of time. That allows them to look some of that over before the clock starts running, and it allows them to know what questions to ask when they get there.
Great, thank you so much.
I think that the idea of clustering or single entity, that's something you need to be very well organized, and if you need to be able to show the auditor that you really are working together and that you have accountability to one another. I mean, there's a little bit of kind of what they call verification that can be useful to have in place. It can't be too loosey-goosey, let's say. There was a question about Clorox bleach that I thought I messed up.
Great, thank you. I was just going to go back because there is now another question that has to do with the Clorox bleach and the fish example that you were giving before. So I'll ask both of them.
Yeah, I saw that.
We can try to combine those. Avery Snipes first asked, can you wash bins, coolers, etc. with Clorox bleach? And also, would you say no to fish fertilizer? And if it's okay, I'll ask just the second, the other question that I think relates. Lindsay said, anything of animal origin is a food safety risk when referring to fish products. Does this also apply to blood meal or bone meal products? So a little bit of a different questions, but one about fish specifically, and one about broader animal products like blood meal and bone meal.
So
Okay, I'll start. You go, Jeff.
okay, I'll start. You can go next. If there is a kill step in the and I'm talking about killing bacteria, obviously not the animals, but hopefully they're already dead. But if there is something in the process for blood meal or bone meal or even fish fertilizer that will kill the bacteria, if it's been heat treated, if it has been treated with a UV light or some kind of fermentation process, sometimes we'll achieve some kill on like composting, for example, will kill bacteria because of the heating. So if a product you're using has those kind of treatments, then it's fine. If it doesn't, you can still use those products, but not as a contact. You would have to think about it when it contacts the edible part of the crop. So let's say you want to apply that before planting, or maybe as part of a transplant solution. That would probably be fine at this point. There may eventually be a days to harvest on those kind of products like manure. We're looking at, well, for a lot of the audits, we look at 120 days to harvest to apply manure. So eventually that may be true for those kind of products as well. As far as the aquaculture, one of the things that was mentioned in that list of things that Lindsay put up there was you needed to water test monthly or periodically to make sure that your treatment system was working. If there is not E. coli in that water or salmonella, and you can test that, then maybe you don't need to have a treatment system. If you can verify that the water that you're putting through that system is is free of bacteria, then I think they would look on that as being effective. So
in answer to the do I recommend no fish fertilizer, I think first of all, if you, as Jeff said, if you're dipping transplant roots into fish fertilizer before you plant them, right now I think that's probably okay. You can decide if you feel like it's really important to be using a foliar fish fertilizer or any other kind of fertilizer that contains animal product that doesn't go through a kill step. Maybe you don't sell that to a customer that requires food safety certification. That's a business decision that you have to make. If you're selling direct to consumer, then it may not be an issue. In the case of the Urban Farm Collective, they wouldn't be able to sell those tomatoes to the customer that requires them to be FSMA compliant. But they could continue to sell them at their farm stands and farmers markets and their other outlets.
Okay, great. Thank you both so much. I'm just looking at the time and realizing we've come to the end of our time for Q&A. We still have a couple left, and I'll share those with the presenters in case you have anything to add before we send out the post-webinar email. And we'll make sure that everybody can see the questions, all the questions that were asked. But just as we wrap up here, I wanted to just start by, again, thanking Jeff and Lindsay so much for sharing your extensive knowledge and experience trying to help navigate through all of these new regulations and these potential scenarios that have come up. As mentioned, Lindsay and Jeff are doing a training at PASA. Gosh, is March 11th just next week? A week and a half.
Yeah, it's a week from Saturday.
So please check that out, pasafarming.org. And that's happening in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in just a week and a half for a hands-on training or an in-person training. As mentioned, please check out your co-op extension websites for trainings within your site. Penn State FSMA, Maryland has information up online, and as do other states within our region and beyond. Also, please, I want to encourage you to sign up for our CFN email list. You can get onto it by going to ChesapeakeFoodshed.net, and you can hear about additional food safety webinars or resources that we have available, and also additional regional food system issues, events, and other opportunities. Also, just wanted to end here by thanking all of the participants. We had a lot of interest in this webinar. Clearly, there are a lot of questions about how to proceed And so we thank you all for showing up. We thank Jeff and Lindsay again for all the care that you gave to the presentation and the Q&A. And we invite everybody who's part of this to continue engaging. We have some upcoming events that are still being worked out, but we'll be having a panel discussion on clean water and healthy soils at the end of April, and then our summer coffee talk schedule is coming soon. We will be following up next week with an email with all the follow-up materials, as well as a webinar survey, which we would really appreciate if you fill out, both for your feedback on this and for your ideas about future programming. I think that's all I've got. Thank you again to Jeff and Lindsay. Thank you everyone else, and hope you have a wonderful day. I just have to stop recording.